It began, as so many curious things do in Street Mary Mead, with something entirely unremarkable. The afternoon sun rested softly over the vicarage garden, where tables stood dressed in white linen and dotted with plates of sandwiches curling slightly at the edges. The annual charity fete had drawn most of the village out of their cottages. There was the faint scent of roses and the sharper one of lemonade that had gone slightly off in the warmth. Children chased one another between the hedges, ladies compared sponge cakes with good-natured malice, and the men discussed municipal drainage as though it were a matter of state. Miss Marple, neat and quietly observant in her straw hat, sat by the tea urn, pouring second cups and making mental notes about everything and everyone, as she always did. Mrs. Penfold, the recent widow with too much enthusiasm and not quite enough tact, was at the center of the event. She wore a bright turquoise dress and, in one hand, held a fan she fluttered as though commanding attention. She was new enough to Street Mary Mead to find its subtleties charming and old enough to believe herself immune to gossip. "Oh, Miss Marple," she had cried earlier that afternoon, "you must tell me who makes those scones. They're so deliciously wicked." Miss Marple smiled gently. She already knew that Mrs. Penfold's curiosity about people's recipes often extended to their affairs. It wasn't until the sun began to lower and the raffle was drawing to a close that Mrs. Penfold's shrill voice rose again, this time not in laughter, but alarm. "My gloves!" she exclaimed, turning to the table where her handbag had been resting. "My white silk gloves! They've gone!" Her distress was so sincere that for a moment it seemed the entire fete had frozen. A missing pair of gloves hardly qualified as drama, but in Street Mary Mead, where true excitement was a rare commodity, it might as well have been a burglary. Colonel Melchett chuckled indulgently and suggested she'd misplaced them. Mrs. Penfold, red-faced and flustered, insisted she hadn't. "They were a gift from my late husband," she said. "I took them off only for a moment." Miss Marple watched quietly from her seat, noting the scene's small, telling details. Mrs. Penfold's handbag slightly ajar, the curious glance exchanged between Mrs. Price Ridley and Miss Hartnell, the awkward silence of young Tom Archer, who had been standing near the table moments before. The gloves were never found that afternoon, though Mrs. Penfold insisted she would ask around in the morning. Most dismissed it as a trivial loss. But Miss Marple, who had long ago learned that small oddities often heralded large consequences, found herself thinking about those white silk gloves as she folded her napkin and rose to leave. There was something faintly wrong in the air, something that had very little to do with missing apparel, and before the week was through, Street Mary Mead would find itself at the heart of a far more serious affair. The following morning dawned with a pale mist over the village, curling low over the hedgerows like breath held in hesitation. The fate's laughter had long since dissolved into the usual hum of quiet routines, brooms against doorsteps, kettles singing, postmen whistling. But beneath that familiar calm, there was a subtle tension that only Street Mary Mead could nurture. For Mrs. Penfold's missing gloves had become, overnight, the chief topic of conversation. By breakfast time, Mrs. Price Ridley had already declared it a deliberate theft, while Miss Hartnell suggested it was probably one of those foreign maids people keep nowadays, no moral backbone. Everyone had a theory, everyone, that is, except Miss Marple, who simply sipped her tea and let her thoughts unfold in their usual, unhurried fashion. At precisely 10:30, Mrs. Penfold herself arrived at Miss Marple's cottage, a flurry of perfume, indignation, and lace handkerchiefs. "You'll think me silly, dear Miss Marple," she began, settling herself on the chintz sofa, "but I can't shake the feeling that someone took them deliberately. You see, they weren't just any gloves. They were from my husband's first trip to Paris, back when he was still courting me. Pure silk, irreplaceable." Her voice trembled, not so much with grief as with the thrill of being the center of something peculiar. Miss Marple nodded sympathetically, folding her hands in her lap. "People do take odd things," she said softly. I recall once, during the harvest festival, Mrs. Haydock lost a rather fine silver button from her coat. It turned up 2 days later in the offertory bag. Most curious, really. Mrs. Penfold's eyes widened. You think the gloves will turn up then? She asked hopefully. Perhaps, Miss Marple murmured. But sometimes, Mrs. Penfold, things vanish not because they are lost, but because they were seen. She let the phrase linger, faintly cryptic, as she poured more tea. Later that day, Miss Marple took a quiet walk through the village. It was her habit, when something troubled her mind, to wander without purpose, though, of course, purpose was always there, hidden beneath her gentle steps. The road to the vicarage wound past the post office, where Mr. Pargeter stood chatting with the grocer about the Fates raffle. A fine turnout, he said. Though I hear poor Mrs. Penfold made a dreadful fuss about her gloves. Miss Marple smiled faintly. People do value sentimental things, she replied. And sentiment, Mr. Pargeter, often tells us more than we expect. He gave her a bemused look, unused to her peculiar way of putting things. At the vicarage gate, Miss Marple paused. The Reverend Clement was tending his dahlias, humming tunelessly. His wife, Griselda, appeared in the doorway with a basket of laundry and called out, "Have you heard, Jane? Poor Mrs. Penfold's gloves have gone missing. The whole village is in an uproar about it. You'd think someone had stolen the communion silver." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. "Yes, dear. I dare say it's the same excitement that makes people so devoted to the serial stories in the paper." Griselda laughed. "Well, I do hope it's nothing serious." Miss Marple gave a small nod but said nothing. By evening, the talk had grown even more tangled. Word had spread that Mrs. Penfold's maid, Clara, a quiet girl from the next village, had been seen carrying a small white parcel as she left the fete. Colonel Melchett, ever the man of action, had wasted no time calling on Mrs. Penfold to look into the matter. When Miss Marple stopped by the next morning, she found the house in mild chaos, doors open, furniture shifted, and Mrs. Penfold close to tears. "They've questioned my poor Clara," she cried. "Colonel Melchett insists she must have taken them. But I simply can't believe it. She's the most timid creature. Besides, why would she steal gloves when she has no reason to wear them?" Miss Marple tilted her head slightly. Indeed, a curious choice of object. If theft was the motive, unless, perhaps, the gloves were taken not for themselves but for what they might conceal. Mrs. Penfold blinked, uncertain whether to be alarmed or intrigued. "Conceal?" she echoed. "My dear Miss Marple, they were just gloves." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured, her gaze drifting toward the window. "Just gloves." That afternoon, Miss Marple happened to meet young Tom Archer outside the post office. He was the gardener's boy, earnest and polite, though a little nervous in her presence. "Good morning, Tom," she greeted kindly. "I hear you were helping with the tables at the fete." He shifted on his feet. "Yes, ma'am. I was putting away the lemonade jugs after everyone left." "How thoughtful," she said, watching him closely. "Tell me, did you happen to notice Mrs. Penfold's things?" Tom's face reddened. "Only that she'd left her bag open." "Ma'am, I didn't touch nothing, though." Miss Marple smiled. "Of course you didn't, dear boy. You've too honest a face for that." He relaxed slightly, though his eyes flickered with something, perhaps guilt, perhaps confusion. Miss Marple caught it but said nothing more. She merely thanked him and went on her way, her mind arranging details like cards on a table. That evening, as twilight settled over Street, Mary Mead, she sat knitting by the window, reflecting on the day's peculiarities. Gloves lost at a fete, a servant questioned, a boy avoiding her gaze. On the surface, it was all trifling nonsense, but Miss Marple had long known that great crimes often began in just such harmless disguise. The village, in its simplicity, mirrored the world itself, full of small deceits, petty envies, and the quiet desperation of being thought respectable. Somewhere in those tangled threads, she felt, lay the reason those gloves had vanished. And as she folded her knitting and looked out across the darkening lane, she felt the faint, familiar thrill of a puzzle beginning to take shape. Before she went to bed, she wrote a short note and sealed it with a small smile. In the morning, she would send it to Inspector Slack at the police station, a man often too brusque to see what stood right before him. "Dear Inspector," she wrote in her neat hand, "I believe the matter of Mrs. Penfold's gloves may not be quite so trivial as it seems. I should very much like to discuss a few observations, if convenient." She paused before signing, her pen resting thoughtfully on the paper. Outside, the night was still. Somewhere, far off, a dog barked once, sharply, as if announcing that the quiet in Street Mary Mead would not last for long. The following morning arrived bright and still, with a thin frost clinging to the lawns and the chimneys of Street Mary, Mead trailing thin ribbons of smoke into a pale sky. Miss Marple, ever punctual, had already taken her breakfast and was darning a pair of stockings when the faint knock came at her door. It was Inspector Slack, looking slightly out of place against the floral wallpaper of her sitting room. He removed his hat and gave a polite, if weary, nod. "Got your note, Miss Marple," he said. "Thought I'd better hear what's troubling you about a pair of gloves." The superintendent laughed when I mentioned it. Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, dear Inspector, people do tend to laugh at little things until they find those little things are rather large indeed." She gestured for him to sit. "Now then, you've spoken to Mrs. Penfold's maid, haven't you?" Slack nodded. "Clara. Quiet girl. Nervous as a rabbit. Says she didn't take the gloves. Of course. Claims she left the fete early. Went straight home. Her landlady backs her up. Personally, I think she's telling the truth. But that widow Mrs. Penfold won't let it drop." Miss Marple listened, her needles clicking softly. "She's an excitable woman," she said, "but not entirely foolish. Something about those gloves has unsettled her. I should like to ask, did she mention to you how her late husband died?" Slack frowned. "Heart failure, wasn't it? Nothing suspicious there." "No," Miss Marple agreed gently. "Nothing on the surface." Slack looked at her curiously. "You think there's something deeper?" Miss Marple gave a small, knowing sigh. "I think, Inspector, that the past rarely stays buried. People in mourning sometimes bring with them a trail of small mysteries. Gloves, for instance, can carry more than warmth. They can carry remembrance or guilt." Slack scratched his chin, unsure how to respond. "If you're suggesting a connection between a widow's gloves and her husband's death, I'm suggesting," Miss Marple interrupted mildly, "that human nature is far more predictable than we like to admit. People act for reasons that seem very small, but they're never random. I wonder, for example, why those gloves vanished at the fete, surrounded by so many watchful eyes." The inspector exhaled through his nose. "Well, I'll keep an open mind, but it's a thin case, if you ask me. No motive, no evidence. Yet," Miss Marple said softly. "No evidence yet." She smiled at him with that patient, grandmotherly expression that often concealed her sharpest thoughts. "If you were to look closely, Inspector, I believe you'd find a small matter worth your attention. Mrs. Penfold's husband was once a solicitor, was he not? Dealt with the affairs of half the county?" "That's right," Slack replied, surprised. "Why?" "Oh, nothing," Miss Marple said with a delicate shrug. "Only that such men often leave behind more than papers when they die, sometimes loose ends." When the inspector left, shaking his head, Miss Marple wrapped her shawl about her shoulders and set out for the village. Her steps took her, as they so often did, not directly to her destination but past the people who formed the living map of Street Mary Mead. At the grocer's, she overheard Mrs. Price Ridley declaring that Clara had shifty eyes and that it was only a matter of time before the police caught her out. At the post office, Miss Hartnell confided to the postmistress that she'd seen a man lurking near the vicarage gate the night after the fete. And at the churchyard, where she paused to rest, She saw Tom Archer again, this time talking in low tones to the Reverend Clement. The boy's shoulders were stiff, and when he noticed Miss Marple's gaze, he turned quickly away. That evening, a thin drizzle set in. Miss Marple sat before her small fire, reading. When another visitor arrived, Griselda Clement, her cheeks pink from the cold. "Jane, you'll never guess," she said breathlessly. "Mrs. Penfold's had another fright. Someone's broken into her late husband's study. Nothing taken, apparently, but she's in hysterics. Poor woman insists it's connected to those missing gloves." Miss Marple looked up, her expression calm but intent. "Broken into, you say? That is interesting. People don't generally break into studies for nothing." Griselda sat down, pulling off her gloves. "She's called for Colonel Melchett again. And half the village is whispering that the thief must have been looking for something her husband left behind. But what could that possibly be?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "That depends," she said softly, "on what sort of man Mr. Penfold truly was, and what secrets his widow may not realize she's protecting." Her voice trailed off into the steady crackle of the fire. "You see, Griselda, if those gloves were a gift from her husband's first trip to Paris, they might remind someone of something better forgotten." Later that night, long after Griselda had gone home, Miss Marple sat alone at her desk, turning over a thought that refused to settle. The missing gloves, the nervous maid, the boy's guilty glance, the widow's fright, all threads in a web that felt, to her, faintly familiar. It was not about theft at all. It was about fear. Someone in Street Mary Mead was afraid not of discovery, but of memory, and that, Miss Marple knew, was a far more dangerous thing. The next morning, she walked to Mrs. Penfold's house, under a pale sun. The widow greeted her in a silk dressing gown, pale and drawn. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's too dreadful. They ransacked his desk, my dear Arthur's desk. Papers everywhere, though they say nothing's missing." Miss Marple looked gently around the room. It was neat now, the disorder tidied away, but she could see faint scratches on the drawer locks and one sheet of parchment set slightly apart on the table. "You've been very brave," she said kindly. "But tell me, was there anything in those drawers you can recall? Letters, perhaps?" Mrs. Penfold frowned. "Just old correspondence, I think. My husband's clients, some foreign letters from years ago." "Oh, and his insurance papers, though I can't imagine anyone wanting those." Miss Marple's eyes lingered on the folded parchment. "May I?" she asked softly. Mrs. Penfold nodded. It was a letter, yellowed and written in a delicate foreign hand. "Paris," Miss Marple read aloud. "Dated nearly 20 years ago." She smiled faintly. "You see, my dear, the past has a way of returning, often wearing new gloves." Mrs. Penfold looked puzzled, but Miss Marple only patted her arm. "Do lock your doors tonight, my dear. I expect we shall have clarity soon. People seldom steal things without leaving a bit of themselves behind." As she stepped out into the brisk air, Miss Marple allowed herself a small sigh of satisfaction. The puzzle was sharpening. The gloves were never merely lost, they were taken as part of a memory someone wished to erase. And the faint scent of Parisian perfume that had lingered on Mrs. Penfold's hands, Miss Marple now realized, was not new at all. It belonged to another woman entirely. The village might still be whispering about silk gloves, but Miss Marple knew the truth had already brushed against them, all light as a whisper, and every bit as dangerous. The morning after Miss Marple's visit to Mrs. Penfold's house brought a peculiar stillness to Street Mary Mead, the sort of quiet that feels not peaceful but expectant. Even the sparrows seemed subdued, fluttering about the hedges with unusual restraint. At the post office, conversation dropped to a whisper when anyone mentioned Mrs. Penfold's name. People sensed something was brewing, something larger than a missing pair of gloves or a frightened widow's imagination. Miss Marple, however, appeared entirely untroubled as she returned from the grocer's with a small paper parcel and a thoughtful look in her eyes. When she reached her cottage, she found a note slipped under her door. It was hastily written in an uneven hand. "Please don't tell anyone, but I think I saw something the night of the fete. Tom." The words were smudged, as if written in haste or fear. Miss Marple held the paper for a long moment before folding it neatly and setting it on her mantelpiece. Then she put on her hat and went out again, her pace steady, her gaze distant. She found Tom Archer behind the church, stacking kindling for the vicar. His face went pale when he saw her approach. "I didn't mean nothing by it, Miss Marple," he stammered before she even spoke. "I just thought maybe it didn't matter." She smiled kindly, the sort of smile that invited truth without demand. "Everything matters, Tom. If it troubles your conscience, sit a moment and tell me what you saw." He hesitated, glancing toward the church door as though afraid someone might overhear. "It was after most folks had gone, ma'am. I was cleaning up the lemonade stall, and I saw Mrs. Penfold talking to a man by the hedge tall, in a grey suit. They were arguing, quiet-like, but it sounded cross. I didn't see his face clear, but he wasn't from round here. When I came back later to fetch the rubbish, she was alone, looked upset." Miss Marple listened without interrupting. "And you didn't mention this before?" she asked gently. "No, ma'am. I didn't think it was important till I heard about the break-in. Thought maybe it was just someone she knew." Miss Marple nodded. "You did right to tell me. Secrets have a way of growing dangerous when left untended." She thanked him softly and went on her way, her mind already piecing the pattern together. That afternoon, she visited Inspector Slack at the station. He looked up from his papers with a groan. "You again, Miss Marple. Don't tell me. You've solved the glove case already." She smiled, serenely. "Not entirely, Inspector, but I believe we are moving closer. There was a man at the fete, unknown to the village, who had a private conversation with Mrs. Penfold shortly before her gloves disappeared. Would it surprise you to learn that her late husband's firm once handled a disputed inheritance involving property in France?" Slack frowned. "You've been digging again." "Only observing," she corrected mildly. Mrs. Penfold's husband acted as executor for a Mr. Charles Darnay, who died under somewhat mysterious circumstances in Paris 20 years ago. There was talk of a missing letter, one that might alter the will entirely. I believe that letter was among Mr. Penfold's papers and that someone has been trying to retrieve it." Slack sat up straighter now, his skepticism giving way to reluctant interest. "And you think those gloves have something to do with it?" Miss Marple folded her hands. "I think," she said quietly, "that Mrs. Penfold found the letter by accident, perhaps hidden in the lining of the gloves, her husband's little keepsake from that Paris trip. She may not have realized what it was, but someone else did." The inspector's brow furrowed. "The man Tom saw may be Darnay's relative, come to reclaim what's his." "Perhaps," Miss Marple murmured, "or perhaps someone closer to home, who knew of its existence all along." That evening, Miss Marple returned home and set a small fire in the grate. The flames danced lightly, reflecting in her eyes as she considered her next step. She had no proof yet, only intuition and a handful of small, telling fragments, but she knew the truth would come soon. In street, Mead. People's masks never held for long. As the clock chimed 7, a knock sounded on her door. It was Griselda again, looking unsettled. "Jane, you won't believe it, Mrs. Penfold's maid has vanished. Packed her things this afternoon and left without a word. The landlady says she looked frightened out of her wits." Miss Marple set down her teacup. "Frightened people," she said softly, "often run toward the very thing they should avoid. Did anyone see where she went?" "The last sighting was near the old railway lane," Griselda said. "It leads toward the woods." Miss Marple rose at once, taking her shawl. "Then we mustn't waste time." Griselda hesitated. "Jane, surely it's not safe." But Miss Marple only smiled. "Oh, my dear, safety is often an illusion. What matters now is that someone understands what the poor girl has stumbled into." The evening air was sharp, carrying the scent of damp earth and wood smoke. The two women followed the narrow path past the cottages, their footsteps muffled in the soft soil. As they reached the lane, they saw movement ahead, a flicker of white cloth near the trees. "Clara!" Miss Marple called softly. The figure froze, then turned, her face pale in the fading light. "I didn't take them," she cried. "I swear I didn't." Miss Marple stepped closer. "My dear, I know you didn't. But you must tell me what you found." Clara's eyes darted between them, wide with fear. "It was in the study last week, before the fete. I was dusting Mr. Penfold's desk, and one of the drawers stuck. When I pulled it open, something fell out, a letter in a foreign envelope. Mrs. Penfold saw it and snatched it up. She told me to forget I'd seen it, but the next day, that man came to the house." "I told him nothing, but he frightened me, miss. Said there'd be trouble if I talked." Miss Marple's voice was steady, though her mind was racing. "And you recognized him?" Clara shook her head. "No, but he had a scar across his hand, like a burn." Behind them, Griselda drew a sharp breath. "That sounds like Mr. Ralston, the solicitor's old clerk. He left town years ago, after a scandal, didn't he?" Miss Marple nodded slowly. "Indeed he did. And if he's returned, then we're nearer the truth than I feared." Clara clutched her shawl, trembling. "What should I do, miss?" Miss Marple placed a gentle hand on her arm. "You'll come back to my cottage for the night. No harm will come to you there. But tomorrow, my dear, we shall pay Mrs. Penfold another visit. For if I'm not mistaken, she's keeping something locked away, not just in her desk, but in her conscience." As they walked back through the misty lane, the first owl called from the woods. Miss Marple said nothing more, but her mind was alight. The pieces were falling into place, now an old scandal, a hidden letter, a widow's trembling secret, and somewhere in that quiet village a man with a scarred hand was watching, waiting for what he believed still belonged to him. By the next morning, the whole village was speaking in lowered voices, as though afraid that the very air might be listening. Clara's disappearance had unsettled them, and while Miss Marple had quietly brought the girl to her cottage for safety, she had told no one except the vicar's wife. Griselda, faithful to her word, had sworn to silence, though her curiosity was almost unbearable. Clara had slept fitfully, waking often in fright, whispering about the man with the scarred hand. Now, as dawn broke grey and uneasy, Miss Marple watched her from across the breakfast table. "You've been very brave, my dear," she said softly, pouring tea into the chipped blue cup. "But we mustn't let fear silence what truth remains. You said Mrs. Penfold took that letter from the drawer. Do you remember what she did with it afterward?" Clara frowned, struggling to recall. "She read it over once, I think. Her face changed, like she'd seen a ghost. Then she put it in her handbag and told me never to mention it again." Miss Marple nodded slowly. "And the man who came asking Mr. Ralston. If our suspicions are correct, he must have known that letter existed and believed it was still in the house." Clara clasped her hands together tightly. "He said he'd been wronged, that Mrs. Penfold's husband cheated him, that something belonged to him by right. He kept asking if I'd seen a French envelope." "Yes," Miss Marple murmured. "That fits rather well." She looked out the window toward the road, where mist was rising in pale ribbons. "You've done the right thing, Clara. Now leave the rest to me. I believe we are close to understanding the truth." By mid-morning, Miss Marple was on her way to Mrs. Penfold's again. The widow opened the door, looking worn and pale, her eyes red-rimmed from a sleepless night. "Miss Marple, I don't know what's happening anymore. They say my maid's vanished, and I can't help thinking it's all connected. That horrid man came again last evening, Mr. Ralston," he called himself. "I told him to leave, but he said something terrible. He said Arthur was a thief." Miss Marple's expression softened. "May I come in, my dear?" Mrs. Penfold led her to the sitting room, still scented faintly of lavender polish. The curtains were drawn halfway, casting long, uncertain shadows across the floor. Miss Marple sat down and folded her hands neatly in her lap. "Mrs. Penfold, I think it would be best if you told me exactly what was in that letter. Not because I wish to pry, but because the truth, once spoken, loses its power to frighten." The widow's eyes flickered with hesitation. Yes, of course. I didn't understand it all. It was written in French. Something about a will, and names I didn't recognize. But one name appeared more than once, Ralston. My husband never mentioned him. Yet the letter seemed to accuse him of keeping something that wasn't his. There was also a signature, Charles Darnay. "Ah," Miss Marple said quietly, as though confirming a long-held suspicion. "You see, my dear, Mr. Darnay was once a client of your husband's. He died unexpectedly in Paris, leaving an estate in dispute. The rightful heir, Ralston, was disinherited when a crucial letter went missing. That letter, I believe, was the very one your husband concealed. He must have hidden it within the lining of your gloves, thinking no one would ever look there. But when you wore them at the fete and set them down, someone recognized them." Mrs. Penfold stared, horrified. "You mean my husband stole from him?" Miss Marple's tone was gentle, but firm. "People make strange decisions under temptation, especially when reputations are at stake. Your husband was a respected man. Perhaps he told himself it was harmless, just a delay, a safeguard. But someone else knew. And now that someone wants what they believe they're owed." The widow clasped her shawl around her shoulders. "Then he'll come again, won't he?" "Yes," Miss Marple said softly. "And that's precisely what we must allow him to do." That evening, under a pale moon, Miss Marple sat once more in Mrs. Penfold's drawing room. The lamps were dimmed, and a single candle burned on the mantelpiece. Inspector Slack waited quietly in the adjoining hall, his shoes squeaking every time he shifted his weight. Mrs. Penfold sat trembling, her eyes darting to the door at every sound. It was just after 9 when the bell rang. A man's voice murmured something indistinct. And then he stepped into the room, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with a scar along his right hand, just as Clara had described. His eyes were sharp, the expression of a man who had spent too long nursing old anger. "Mrs. Penfold," he said, "I warned you I'd return. You've had time to think. Where is it?" She opened her mouth, but Miss Marple rose first. "Good evening, Mr. Ralston," she said calmly. "You've come for the letter, I believe, but it's of no use to you now." He started, taken aback. "Who the devil are you?" "An old woman who notices things," she said mildly. "The letter you seek was never yours to reclaim through threat or trespass. It has already been turned over to the proper authorities. You see, deceit often breeds more deceit, and I thought it best to stop the cycle before it went any further." For a moment, his expression faltered, uncertainty flickering across his face. Then he sneered. "You're lying." "Am I?" Miss Marple said quietly. She nodded toward the hall, and Inspector Slack stepped forward, his presence filling the doorway. "Good evening, sir. We've been expecting you." Ralston froze. His eyes darted toward the window, but Slack was already between him and the exit. "You can't arrest me," he said harshly. "That letter proves everything." "It proves," Miss Marple said, her voice soft but unwavering, "that your claim was genuine but your methods were not. And the moment you forced your way into that house last night, you turned justice into blackmail." For a long, heavy moment, no one spoke. Then the man's shoulders slumped. "He ruined me," he muttered. "Your husband ruined me." "Yes," Miss Marple said gently. "And perhaps you would have had your justice in time. But revenge, Mr. Ralston, rarely restores what we think it will. It only darkens the path ahead." When he was finally led away, Mrs. Penfold sat very still, the candle trembling in the draught. "I never knew," she whispered. "All these years, I thought Arthur so good. So honest. Miss Marple placed a kind hand on her arm. We none of us see the full truth of those we love, my dear, but take comfort. You've faced it now with courage. The village will talk, of course, but time has a way of quieting even the loudest gossip. Outside, the night had cleared, and the air smelled faintly of rain. As Miss Marple walked home along the dark lane, the sound of the church clock echoed softly across the fields. It struck 10, calm and final, as though marking not an ending, but a quiet understanding. Merry Mead. Peace had returned once more, but Miss Marple knew, as always, that beneath every calm surface, human nature waited, restless and unchanging. For the next few days, Merry Mead seemed to settle back into its usual rhythm, though the calm felt a touch artificial, like lace drawn over a stain. Mrs. Penfold kept to her house, her curtains half drawn, and Clara remained quietly at Miss Marple's cottage, helping with small tasks and trying to steady her nerves. The villagers, having feasted well on rumour, were now moving on to other amusements. Yet beneath the ordinary hum of village life, Miss Marple felt a certain wrongness lingering, faint but persistent, like a note slightly off-key. The affair with Miss Ralston was concluded, or so it seemed, but some instinct within her refused to let the matter rest. It was not only that Mrs. Penfold's grief had turned oddly hollow. It was that the story, tidy as it appeared, still contained a piece that did not quite fit. It was during tea with the vicar and Griselda that the feeling sharpened. "Quite a remarkable outcome, Jane," said the Reverend Clement, stirring his cup. "You prevented what might have been a nasty business. Mrs. Penfold must be greatly relieved." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, one would think so." Griselda looked up from her knitting. "You sound doubtful, Jane. Surely it's over now." "Perhaps," Miss Marple said, her gaze fixed on the steam curling above her cup. "But you know, my dear, I can't help thinking of that break-in. Ralston was a desperate man, but not a careless one. If he had come for the letter, why leave without it, especially when Mrs. Penfold insists she never handed it over to him?" The vicar frowned. "But you said you found the letter in her desk, did you not?" "Yes," she replied softly, "and that is precisely what troubles me. It was placed too conveniently, as though meant to be found." That night, she sat by the fire in her cottage, her knitting untouched, her thoughts circling quietly. Human beings, she reflected, were very much like her garden, orderly on the surface, yet full of tangled roots beneath. Mr. Ralston's guilt had been evident enough, but guilt was rarely solitary. Somewhere in the pattern, another hand had moved, careful, deliberate, unseen. And the gloves, those white silk gloves, still lay at the heart of it all. Where, she wondered, had they truly gone? The answer began to form the next morning when Clara, who had been sweeping the hall, suddenly paused. "Miss," she said hesitantly, "I've been thinking about that night, the fete. There's something I forgot to mention. When I went back to fetch Mrs. Penfold's shawl, I saw her talking to Mrs. Price Ridley. They were near the refreshment tent, and Mrs. Price Ridley had something white in her hand, looked like cloth, but I couldn't tell for sure." Miss Marple's needles stopped mid-air. "Mrs. Price Ridley?" she repeated softly. "Yes, miss." And she looked ever so cross about something. Within the hour, Miss Marple was on her way to pay a visit. Mrs. Price Ridley received her with her usual mixture of suspicion and pride, bustling her into the parlour lined with photographs of long-forgotten relatives. "Such a to-do about those gloves," she sniffed. "Really, Jane, the whole thing's been blown out of proportion. One might think we were a den of thieves." Miss Marple smiled gently. "Yes, it does seem rather extraordinary, doesn't it? Especially since poor Mrs. Penfold has suffered such distress. I was hoping, my dear, that you might recall seeing them after the fete." Mrs. Price Ridley blinked. "Seeing them? Why, certainly not. I should think I have better things to do than notice another woman's accessories." "Of course," Miss Marple said sweetly. though it must have been difficult not to notice something so fine and so white against all that summer green. The older woman's composure wavered. "What are you implying, Jane?" "Only that I believe you may have found the gloves quite by accident and meant to return them, but circumstances distracted you. Perhaps Mrs. Penfold's manner put you off. She can be rather overbearing when flustered." Mrs. Price Ridley's lips thinned. "I hardly think my memory is the issue here." "No," Miss Marple said softly. "I dare say it isn't. It's conscience that tends to trouble one more." A long silence followed. Then Mrs. Price Ridley drew a breath, sharp as a pin. "Very well, if you must know. I did find the gloves. They'd fallen behind the table near the raffle box. I picked them up, intending to return them, but when I opened the handbag to put them inside, there was a letter sticking out. I read only a line or two purely by accident, of course, but it mentioned a sum of money and the name Ralston. I thought it best to hand it to the vicar for safekeeping. But when I looked again later, it was gone, vanished. I assumed Mrs. Penfold had retrieved it." Miss Marple's eyes softened, though her voice remained calm. "I see. And you told no one?" "I didn't want to be drawn into scandal, Mrs." Price Ridley said defensively. "You know how people talk." Miss Marple left soon after, her mind quietly alive with the new detail. The letter had moved before Mrs. Penfold ever mentioned finding it. Someone had taken it from the vicarage, then placed it back into the study drawer days later, where she had discovered it anew. It was a delicate game of misdirection, and there was only one person who could have played it convincingly, a person with access to both houses and every reason to protect Mrs. Penfold's reputation. That evening, Miss Marple sent for Inspector Slack once more. "I fear," she said gently when he arrived, "that we've been a little premature in closing the case. The truth, as so often, is more tangled than it first appears." He frowned. "You're not going to tell me the widow's involved?" "Not directly," Miss Marple replied, "but someone close to her is. Someone who wished to shield her from the shame of her husband's deceit, even if it meant framing another. You see, the gloves were never stolen. They were used to hide the letter, then conveniently lost, so that its discovery would seem accidental and absolve the widow of blame." Slack stared at her. "You mean Clara?" Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Inspector. Clara is far too frightened to weave such a web. The person we seek is clever, discreet, and has access to the vicarage desk where the letter first vanished. I think you'll find, upon inspection, that the good Reverend Clement has been busier than he lets on." For once, Slack was speechless. "The vicar," he repeated. "But why?" "Because," said Miss Marple quietly, "he understood mercy far better than truth, and sometimes, in street Mary Mead, that is the more dangerous of the two." Outside, the wind began to rise, carrying with it the faint chime of the church clock. Miss Marple watched the inspector's carriage disappear into the lane, her knitting lying forgotten in her lap. Somewhere, the final piece was sliding into place, and though she felt a twinge of sorrow for what the morning would bring, she knew it was the only way peace could truly return to the village. Inspector Slack was not a man given to subtlety, and when Miss Marple suggested that the Reverend Clement might have tampered with evidence, his first instinct was to dismiss it as absurd. Yet as he rode back toward the vicarage that evening, something in her calm certainty unsettled him. The lane was dark now, the air heavy with the damp scent of fallen leaves. The church bell had struck 9 by the time he reached the vicar's gate, and through the study window he could see the faint glow of lamplight. Inside, the Reverend sat at his desk, pen poised above a sheet of paper, his expression weary. When Slack knocked and entered, Clement looked up in mild surprise. "Inspector. Out rather late, aren't you?" "Evening, Reverend," Slack said gruffly, removing his hat. "Sorry to intrude, but I'd like to ask you a few more questions about that letter found at Mrs. Penfold's. Just routine, you understand." The vicar folded his hands on the desk. "Of course, though I rather thought that business was concluded." So did I, Slack replied. But Miss Marple, well, she has a way of finding new threads. Said something about you having the letter here once. For a heartbeat, there was stillness. Then Clement exhaled softly. Ah, so she's guessed, has she? He rose, crossed to the cabinet, and took out a small envelope, yellowed and creased. Yes, Inspector, I did have it. Mrs. Price Ridley brought it to me after the fete. She was flustered, worried it might be something improper. I meant to return it to Mrs. Penfold quietly, but before I could, it went missing. I assumed she had reclaimed it herself. Slack's brow furrowed. But you never reported it? The vicar's expression held no defensiveness, only resignation. I thought it best not to stir more gossip. This village thrives on scandal like ivy on old brick. I believed I was doing a kindness. Slack studied him for a moment, then said bluntly, Miss Marple seems to think you planted it back in the widow's desk. A faint smile touched the vicar's lips. She's quite right. When I learned of the break-in, I realized the situation was spiraling beyond control. Mrs. Penfold was being hounded, and Ralston was desperate. I thought if the letter were found in her possession, the truth would seem accidental and end the matter quietly. Perhaps it was foolish, but I saw no other way. Foolish, yes, Slack said, rubbing his jaw, but hardly criminal. You may have complicated things, though. Miss Marple's got a sharp mind for motive. The vicar gave a tired nod. She always does. I only wanted to protect an innocent woman's memory of her husband. The poor soul's grief was genuine, even if the man himself was not. Slack took the letter, sealed it in an evidence envelope, and left without further comment. Outside, the night had turned colder, the mist thick along the lane. When he passed Miss Marple's cottage, he saw her light still burning. Against his better judgment, he knocked. She greeted him as though she had expected him all along, a shawl drawn neatly around her shoulders. Ah, Inspector, I gather the Reverend has been most obliging, Slack grunted. You were right, of course. He admits it. Says he did it to protect the widow. Doesn't seem to have gained anything by it, though. Doesn't strike me as a man with secrets to hide. Miss Marple poured him a cup of tea and regarded him with quiet amusement. No, not secrets, exactly. Only guilt of another sort. The Reverend's kindness, you see, is also his weakness. He thought himself wise enough to control the truth. But truth, Inspector, is a little like fire. It slips its boundaries the moment one tries to contain it. Slack frowned, setting down his cup. You talk as if the case isn't finished. We've got the letter. We've got Ralston's confession, and now we've got the vicar's meddling explained. What else could there be? Miss Marple's eyes glimmered in the lamplight, a motive still half hidden, I think. Tell me, Inspector, has anyone confirmed that Ralston acted alone in breaking into Mrs. Penfold's study? Slack hesitated. No sign of an accomplice. He claims he forced the lock himself. And yet, Miss Marple murmured, he would hardly have known the precise drawer to search unless someone told him where to look. It's all rather too efficient for a man driven only by desperation. The inspector stared at her. You think Mrs. Penfold helped him? I think, she said softly, that grief can take many forms. Sometimes it conceals fear, sometimes relief. I observed her the night of his arrest, no outrage, no real surprise, only exhaustion, as though she had been waiting for the inevitable. And remember, it was she who insisted the gloves were stolen, though no one had seen them near her table since early in the afternoon. Slack sat back, uneasy now. You're saying she knew what the gloves contained all along? Not at first, Miss Marple said, but perhaps later when she read the letter and understood what it meant. Her husband's dishonesty, the threat of exposure, the ruin of her good name. I suspect she contacted Ralston herself, hoping to return the letter quietly and buy his silence. But he wanted more than forgiveness. When she realized that, she panicked and staged the missing glove incident to make herself appear a victim. It was quite clever in a sad way. The inspector shook his head slowly. If that's true, she's guiltier than he is. Miss Marple's gaze softened. Guilt, Inspector, is a many-layered thing. I think Mrs. Penfold's greatest crime was loving a man who deceived her and then lying to protect the memory of what she wished him to be. Such lies often turn poisonous. The clock struck 11. Outside, the wind rattled the window panes. Slack stood and pulled on his coat. I'll pay her a visit first thing in the morning. If you're right, we'll find proof. Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes distant. You won't need to look far. She'll have left it for you herself. People who've carried a secret too long seldom wake another day without unburdening it. The next morning, just after dawn, the bell at the police and station rang. A constable hurried down to the lane where Mrs. Penfold's house stood, its garden silvered by frost. The front door was ajar. Inside, the fire had burned low, and on the writing desk lay a sealed envelope addressed to Inspector Slack, and beside it, a pair of white silk gloves folded neatly atop a black shawl. Mrs. Penfold herself sat motionless in the chair by the window, her eyes closed, her expression strangely peaceful. Later, as the church bells tolled across street, Mary Mead. Miss Marple stood by her gate, the morning sun catching her silver hair. Poor woman, she murmured. In the end, she could only confess to silence. She turned back toward her cottage, the village once again returning to its gentle rhythm. And though peace had returned, Miss Marple knew, as she always did, that beneath the stillness of every English garden, something dark was always quietly taking root. The news of Mrs. Penfold's death spread through Street Mary Mead with the quiet inevitability of dawn itself. By mid-morning, the postmistress had heard, the butcher had embellished, and Mrs. Price Ridley had already concluded that guilt and disgrace will always out. Yet, beneath all the talk and pity, there lingered a deep unease, a sense that something, though ended, had not truly been resolved. Miss Marple, who never mistook an ending for a conclusion, sat by her parlor window that same morning, gazing absently at the frost melting from her garden wall. The air smelled faintly of smoke from the vicarage chimney, and the sound of a milk cart faded down the lane. Life in the village resumed, but not quite as it had before. Inspector Slack arrived just before noon, his manner subdued. He removed his hat as he entered, his usual bluntness softened by fatigue. "You were right again, Miss Marple," he said after a pause. "She left a note, short one. Said she'd been foolish, that she couldn't bear the shame. Nothing about Ralston or the letter, and though. No confession as such. Just sorrow." Miss Marple nodded, folding her hands neatly on her lap. "It's often the way, Inspector. People rarely confess to crimes of the heart. They only confess to regret." Slack sighed, sitting heavily in the chair opposite her. "The gloves were on her desk when we found her, perfectly clean, pressed flat. You'd think she'd been trying to make them right again before the end." Miss Marple looked into the fire, the faintest frown shadowing her face. "Yes, but one never truly makes such things right, does one? Only tidy. And tidiness, Inspector, is sometimes the most telling disguise." He frowned. "You think there's more still?" "I think," she said softly, "there always is." Mrs. Penfold was a woman of pride, but not of invention. She would not have written that note of her own accord. Its phrasing was too measured, too composed for a woman on the verge of despair. Slack blinked. "You're saying someone helped her write it?" "Not helped," Miss Marple murmured, "but guided, perhaps even persuaded." She rose and crossed to a small writing table where a thin letter lay open. "I had a visitor this morning, Mrs. Clement. She was quite upset, poor thing. The vicar has been taken ill, apparently, and she said he's refusing visitors. Odd timing, don't you think?" Slack's jaw tightened. "You don't believe in coincidences, do you?" "Not in Street Mary Mead," she replied with a gentle smile. "They're rather like unicorns, beautiful in theory, but never actually seen." By late afternoon, the inspector and Miss Marple stood together in the vicarage study. The room smelled faintly of old books and pipe tobacco. The vicar sat in an armchair by the window, pale and drawn, his Bible resting unopened on the table beside him. "Inspector," he greeted softly, "and Miss Marple. I suppose you've come about poor Mrs. Penfold." "We have," Miss Marple said, her voice as mild as tea on a winter's morning. "Such a tragedy. I only wish she'd found comfort before it was too late." He nodded slowly, though his gaze drifted past them. She was a kind soul, despite her faults. Her death was inevitable, I fear. She'd lost her faith in everything, even herself. Miss Marple tilted her head, and yet she seemed so composed at the end. Her note was eloquent, even serene. "You knew her well. Reverend, does that sound like the woman you last saw?" A flicker of something guilt, or perhaps weariness, crossed his face. "I went to her yesterday evening," he admitted. "She sent for me. She wanted absolution, of a sort. I tried to comfort her. We spoke for some time, and she asked me to write down a few words for her. Something fitting for a farewell. I didn't think she meant to do what she did." Inspector Slack stiffened. "So you did write it?" The vicar's eyes closed briefly. "I only helped her express what she could not." Miss Marple watched him quietly. "And afterward, did she seem calmer?" "Yes," he said, his voice hollow. "She thanked me, said she finally understood forgiveness. I thought I'd done her some good." Miss Marple's tone softened, but her words were deliberate. "You did her a kindness, Reverend, but I wonder, did she ask you to return the gloves?" He looked startled. "The gloves? No. Why should she? Because she never would have placed them neatly upon her desk herself. Not those gloves, symbols of her guilt, of deceit. A woman in despair does not fold her sins into a perfect square before dying. Someone else did that. Someone who wanted her death to appear peaceful." The vicar's face had gone ashen. Slack stepped forward. "You were the last person to see her alive." "Yes," Clement whispered. "But I swear, she was alive when I left her. I prayed with her." "I left just after 9. Miss Marple regarded him with deep sadness. "You meant to save her reputation, didn't you? You saw that she could not bear exposure, that her husband's deceit and your own interference had entangled her beyond escape. So you chose mercy over truth. You gave her words that sounded like peace and left her with something to finish what she could not face herself." He looked up sharply. "No, I didn't harm her." "No," Miss Marple said quietly. "I don't believe you did. But you made it possible for her to die, believing there was no other way. That, in its own way, is the greater harm." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the faint ticking of the vicar's clock. Then he buried his face in his hands. "God forgive me. I thought I was sparing her." Miss Marple laid a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Perhaps he will, in time. But forgiveness, Reverend, is not granted for what we hide, it is earned for what we bear." When they left the vicarage, the sky had deepened to indigo, the first stars trembling faintly above the church spire. The lane was quiet, the world washed in that peculiar stillness that follows confession. Slack walked beside her without speaking until they reached her gate. "Do you ever get used to it?" he asked finally. "To what, Inspector?" "The way good intentions can ruin people." Miss Marple smiled faintly, her eyes glinting in the half-light. "Oh, my dear man, that's the oldest story in the world. Adam meant only to taste knowledge. Eve meant only to share it. And yet here we are, still trying to tidy up after them." She turned toward her cottage, her lamp flickering through the curtains as she disappeared inside. The inspector lingered a moment longer in the lane, listening to the faint wind moving through the yews, before walking on into the dark, where the village kept its quiet secrets, each folded as neatly as a pair of white silk gloves. The day after Mrs. Penfold's quiet funeral, Street Mary, Mead seemed wrapped in a strange stillness, not mourning, exactly, but the hush that follows when a mystery has been declared finished by all but one mind. Villagers spoke of her in tones of practiced sympathy, but most had already turned their thoughts to next week's bazaar or the vicar's upcoming sermon. Only Miss Marple, trimming her rose bushes in the thin sunlight, still felt that odd dissonance in the air. Something beneath the surface remained untidy, like a thread unpulled. The human heart, she often said, seldom ended its stories neatly, even when the world insisted otherwise. That afternoon, Inspector Slack appeared again, looking unusually hesitant for a man who prided himself on decisiveness. "I thought I'd bring you this," he said, holding out a small parcel wrapped in brown paper. "We found it among Mrs. Penfold's effects. There's a letter inside addressed to you." Miss Marple took it without surprise, as though she had been expecting precisely that. "Thank you, Inspector," she said softly. He lingered by the gate, clearly torn between professional duty and personal curiosity. "We're closing the case," he said at last. "Coroner's verdict will be suicide. No sign of foul play, no second cup, no missing medicine. Still, there's something about it all I can't quite settle." Miss Marple's eyes twinkled faintly. "That, Inspector, is the price of having a conscience. It rarely permits tidy endings." After he had gone, she carried the parcel inside and opened it by the fire. Inside lay the letter, written in Mrs. Penfold's fine, looping script. "My dear Miss Marple," it began, "you will forgive me for writing, I hope, though we scarcely knew one another beyond kind conversation. You seemed, at the end, to understand me better than I understood myself. If these words reach you, it will mean I have chosen peace, though I fear peace is never quite earned when it must be taken." Miss Marple paused, her fingers still against the paper. The tone was restrained but revealing, as though each sentence had been carefully weighed. The next lines were even more troubling. "You must not think too harshly of the Reverend. He tried to guide me. I asked him for courage, and he gave me gentleness instead. The rest, I think, was my own decision. There was no direct admission, no apology for deceit, only a faint undercurrent of resignation. And then, at the bottom, one more line, almost an afterthought. "If anyone asks about the gloves, tell them they were never meant to be worn." Miss Marple sat very still. The fire crackled softly, casting a wavering light across her thoughtful face. Never meant to be worn. The phrase struck her as both literal and poetic, too deliberate to be meaningless. Rising slowly, she crossed to her sewing basket, where the gloves had been placed after the inquest, neatly folded and returned to her for safekeeping. She turned them over in her hands. They were immaculate, the silk smooth and cold, but when she pressed along the seam, her finger caught on something faintly rigid. She fetched her embroidery scissors and, with the delicate precision of a woman who had mended countless hems, slit open the inner lining. A slip of paper, folded to the size of a postage stamp, fell into her palm. The ink was faint, but legible, a single name, written in a foreign hand. Emile Moreau. Her expression did not change, but her mind began quietly assembling the missing pieces. She remembered the original letter from Paris, the references to Mr. Darnay's estate, and to Ralston's grievance. Emile Moreau, yes, the name had appeared once before, barely noticed. The supposed witness to Darnay's will, long presumed dead, and if this name had been hidden all these years, then perhaps the entire affair, the inheritance, the accusation, even Ralston's return, had been built upon one more falsehood. The idea that Moreau's testimony had ever existed at all. Miss Marple took her coat and went at once to the vicarage. Griselda answered the door, her expression weary. "Jane, he's resting," she whispered. "The poor man's quite undone. He hasn't eaten since yesterday." "I shan't stay long," Miss Marple said gently, "but I think he may want to hear what I've found." The Reverend was sitting by the hearth, pale but alert. He looked up as she entered, a faint shadow of shame crossing his face. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "have you come to scold me again?" "Not scold," she replied, only to finish what she began. She placed the small slip of paper on the table. This was hidden in the gloves. He leaned forward, adjusting his spectacles. When he read the name, his eyes widened. Good Lord Moreau, but he died years ago. Precisely, said Miss Marple softly, and yet his name remained hidden where only Mrs. Penfold could one day find it. I believe Mr. Penfold knew that the witness to Darnay's will had never existed. The whole inheritance matter was a fiction, arranged to deflect suspicion. When he died, the truth was sealed away with this little scrap of paper. Mrs. Penfold found it, of course, after his death, and realized her husband's crime was not one of theft, but of invention. She hid it again, hoping to bury the truth a second time. But Ralston's return forced it to the surface. The Reverend sank back into his chair. Then she never truly understood what she'd discovered. Oh, I think she did, Miss Marple said, and that's why she couldn't live with it. You see, she might have forgiven her husband's greed, but not his deceit. To discover one has been living beside a lie, Reverend, it's rather like finding a mirror in one's home that no longer reflects the truth. For a long moment, only the ticking clock filled the silence. Then the vicar said softly, "You'll tell no one?" "There's nothing to tell," Miss Marple replied. "A dead man's lie harms no one now, and Mrs. Penfold's peace, whatever its cost, should not be disturbed." She gave him a small, weary smile. "The village will prefer a simpler story." They always do. When she returned home, the evening light was fading, the sky a soft wash of violet. She placed the gloves back into her drawer, folded neatly once more, and sat beside the window with her knitting. The pattern slipped easily through her fingers, precise and unhurried. Outside, the village lamps flickered to life, and the church bell tolled. 6, steady, familiar, eternal. Miss Marple glanced toward the sound, her eyes thoughtful, her expression serene. The matter, at last, was closed. But as she often said to herself, closure was only another word for silence, and silence, in Street Mary Mead, was never truly empty. A light drizzle began to fall that evening, drawing faint silver lines across the windowpane of Miss Marple's sitting room. She had set aside her knitting, though the needles still rested in her lap, forgotten. The discovery of Emile Moreau's name had left her mind humming quietly, not in agitation, but in that deep, reflective way she often described as the space between one truth and the next. Outside, the lamps glowed in hazy halos through the mist, and she could just make out the slow, rhythmic toll of the church bell as the Reverend called for evensong. Yet the sound no longer carried the comfort it once had. It lingered too long in the air, like an echo reluctant to fade. There was a soft knock at her door. When she opened it, Inspector Slack stood on the step, damp from the rain, his collar turned up. "I won't stay long," he said, his tone oddly subdued, "but something's come up. A wire arrived from the Paris police this afternoon about that name you mentioned." He took off his hat, water dripping to the mat. "Seems Emile Moreau was never registered as dead. He was declared missing in 1908 after a fire in his lodgings. But no remains were ever identified. They've checked the archives. And here's the interesting part. His signature appears on a series of legal documents dated 3 years after the supposed fire. Same handwriting as the letter found in Penfold's desk." Miss Marple's expression didn't change, but her fingers tightened slightly on the edge of the door. "Then the witness to Mr. Darnay's will wasn't a fabrication at all," she murmured. "He was a ghost in plain sight." Slack gave a humorless chuckle. "If you like. But what matters is this. Those later documents weren't connected to the estate at all. They were bank transfers, all bearing Penfold's name. Looks like our respectable solicitor was funneling money through Moreau's identity for years. Blackmail, perhaps, or something worse." Miss Marple stepped back to let him in, the wheels of thought already turning behind her calm blue eyes. Mrs. Penfold must have discovered it. Perhaps that was the true source of her despair. Not merely deceit, but partnership in something criminal. The handwriting on her final letter, the one she left for you, it's not entirely hers." He reached into his coat and produced a folded sheet. The coroner's clerk noticed it first. Some of the lines change slope midway. The pressure shifts. It's faint, but clear enough. We've compared samples. Whoever helped her write it didn't just suggest the words, they finished them. Miss Marple took the letter, scanning it under the lamp. Her voice, when she spoke, was quiet, but firm. "The Reverend," she said. "Of course it was." Slack nodded grimly. "I thought as much. We've questioned him again, but he's unwell. Doctor says he's had a shock. Keeps repeating that he meant only to comfort her. I think he genuinely believes that. But there's one more piece you should see." He laid a small, creased envelope on the table. "Found this in her fire grate, half burned. Addressed to Ralston. Never posted." Miss Marple unfolded the charred paper with care. The ink was blurred but readable. "The truth is larger than either of us. You were right about the letter, but wrong about my husband. He was not the thief. He was the keeper. The rest was lost to flame." Miss Marple's brow furrowed, her gaze distant. "The keeper," she repeated softly. "Not the thief. Then Mr. Penfold did not steal the letter. He protected it, perhaps even from Ralston himself." Slack frowned. "But why would he do that?" "Because," Miss Marple said, "the letter was dangerous in the wrong hands. If Mr. Penfold discovered that Moreau and Ralston were both involved in embezzlement, he may have hidden the document to protect the widow of Darnay or to shield the church if funds were being laundered through charitable trusts. He must have realized exposure would ruin not only himself, but many others. And when he died, he took the truth with him. Mrs. Penfold inherited not wealth, but silence. That was her true burden." The inspector leaned forward, his rough voice low. "And you think she carried that burden till the end?" "Yes," Miss Marple said, "but the Reverend carried it too," once she told him. "It was why he helped her write that letter, why he folded the gloves so neatly afterward. It wasn't guilt over deception, but sorrow for what mercy demanded. He believed that allowing her to die quietly was an act of grace." For a long while, neither spoke. The rain had deepened outside, tapping steadily against the glass. Slack rose at last, his heavy boots scraping softly on the rug. "I'll make my report," he said, "but somehow I doubt the file will ever tell it as neatly as you've just done." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "The law records facts, Inspector. But life is made of feelings, and it's often the feelings that tell the truth." After he left, she sat again by the window, watching the blurred glow of the street lamp in the wet lane. The sound of the church bell drifted faintly through the rain, 3 slow, mournful chimes. Penfold, her white gloves folded upon the desk, her face peaceful at last, of the Reverend, bowed by kindness that had turned into tragedy, of Mr. Penfold, the keeper of a secret so tangled that only death had managed to resolve it. She took the gloves from the drawer one final time. The cut seam was nearly invisible now, her careful stitches concealing what had been undone. For a moment she held them close to the light, watching how the silk caught the flame's reflection, pure, unblemished, deceptive. Then she laid them back in the drawer, pressed flat between 2 pages of her gardening almanac. "Not meant to be worn," she murmured to herself, echoing Mrs. Penfold's words. No, not worn but remembered. Outside, the rain thinned into mist, the lane soft with moonlight. The village would sleep soundly tonight, its gossip finally exhausted. And yet, as Miss Marple closed her eyes and listened to the quiet hum of the world returning to itself, she knew the story of the gloves would live on, not in talk or scandal, but in the quiet understanding that beneath every small tragedy lay something infinitely human. The wish to keep a secret, and the hope that someone gentle might one day understand it. She reached for her knitting once more, the needles clicking softly like the steady pulse of time. The case of Mrs. Penfold's missing gloves was over. But in Street Mary Mead, as Miss Marple well knew, endings were never quite the same as peace. The following morning broke clear and cold, the sort of morning that stripped the village of illusion. Mist still clung to the churchyard, softening the outlines of headstones, but the air was sharp and unsparing. Miss Marple rose, early, though she had slept little. There was a restlessness about her movements that morning, a faint unease that knitting and tea could not soothe. Something remained unresolved, not in the matter of guilt or law, but in the quiet weight of truth. She had lived too long among human frailty to mistake the stillness of completion for peace. Around 8 o'clock, the postman brought a foreign envelope, thin, pale blue, the address written in a precise continental hand. The postmark was Paris. She opened it at her table, her teacup steaming beside her, and read the single page within. The letter was brief, almost courteous. "Madame," it began, "I write in respect of the late Arthur Penfold. I have learned only now of his death, and of certain matters once shared between us. If it is possible, I wish to recover some documents entrusted to him long ago, which were never meant to pass to others. I will come to Street Mary Mead within the week. My name, as you may guess, is Emile Moreau." Miss Marple read the signature twice, her lips tightening in thought. So the ghost was real after all. She folded the letter neatly and slipped it into her pocket before setting out for the vicarage. The morning light slanted through the hedges, bright but cold, and her breath hung visibly in the air as she walked. The Reverend was in the garden when she arrived, pruning the dead stems from the rose bushes with slow, distracted movements. He looked up at her approach, his face drawn and pale. "Miss Marple," he said quietly, "I wondered if you'd come. I suppose the inspectors told you about the new development." "Yes," she replied, handing him the letter. "It appears we were all mistaken about Mr. Moreau's fate." He read it quickly, his expression tightening. Good Lord. Then the man exists. That means all the old accusations, the money, the will, they'll be opened again. "I expect so," Miss Marple said calmly, "though I dare say the police will find." The trail rather faded. What interests me more is his reason for writing now, after so many years of silence. He knew Mr. Penfold well enough to entrust him with something valuable, something that should have been returned long ago. The question, Reverend, is why he never came before. The vicar hesitated. Perhaps he was afraid, or perhaps he thought the secret was better kept. Miss Marple gave a small smile. "You sound almost like me, Reverend." Then more seriously, "Do you still have the parish records from that year? I'd like to see the donations Mr. Penfold made near the end of his life." He looked puzzled, but led her inside, where the great leather-bound ledger sat on the study desk. Together they traced the lines of neat entries, collections for the church roof, the orphan fund, the mission in Tangier. Near the bottom of the page, a single entry stood out. Anonymous donation, £1,000, marked for the Society of Street Hilaire. The Reverend frowned. "That's not one of ours. It's a French charity, I believe." "Indeed," said Miss Marple softly. "And I rather think that's where the missing money went. Mr. Penfold was not concealing theft, Reverend. He was returning what had been stolen only through less direct channels." Her eyes moved toward the window, where a pale beam of sun caught the edge of the church tower. He used the church to do what the law would not allow, make restitution without exposure. That was the secret he kept, and the one that destroyed his wife when she learned it too late. The vicar closed the ledger slowly. Then she died, thinking him guilty, when in fact he was trying to make amends. "Yes," Miss Marple said, her voice low. "And that, Reverend, is the cruelest truth of all, that sometimes redemption looks very much like deceit to those left behind." A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Inspector Slack, looking brisk but uneasy. "Morning, Reverend." "Miss Marple. Sorry to intrude, but there's been a development. We've had a telegram from Dover." A Frenchman arrived on the morning ferry, asking for directions to Street Mary Mead. Description matches this Moreau fellow. He handed Miss Marple a slip of paper. He's coming here today. Miss Marple glanced at the clock. Then we'd best be ready to receive him. By late afternoon, the Parisian arrived, a tall, spare man in his 60s, with a neat beard and the weary refinement of someone who had long lived with memory. His manners were courteous but distant. He asked first for the vicar. Then, at Miss Marple's gentle insistence, took tea in her sitting room. "I did not expect," he said in careful English, "to find so much sorrow waiting behind my letter." Miss Marple regarded him quietly. "Truth often brings sorrow with it, Monsieur Moreau, but perhaps, today, it can also bring peace. You wrote that you wished to recover certain papers. I believe they were destroyed long ago, though what they contained may yet matter." He looked down at his hands, long and elegant, a musician's hands. "They were confessions," he said at last, "Darnay's, mine, and Penfold's. We were young men, foolish and ambitious. The estate, the money, it was never ours by right. We conspired to create a will that would secure it, then regretted it all too late. Penfold took the burden on himself. He kept the letter not to deceive, but to prevent scandal. He wrote to me once, years later, saying he wished to make it right. I never answered. I thought silence would spare us both." Miss Marple's gaze softened, though her tone remained steady. "And yet it did not. Silence seldom spares anyone, monsieur." He gave a tired smile. "No, madame, it only postpones the pain." When he rose to leave, Miss Marple walked him to the door. Outside, the first snow had begun to fall, drifting softly over the lane and the garden beyond. "You have done what you could," she said gently. "The rest, I think, is for God and memory." He bowed slightly. "Then I shall let memory keep what I no longer can." When he had gone, she stood for a long while in the open doorway, the snow gathering faintly on her shawl. The air smelled of smoke and frost, clean and bitter. Somewhere down the road, she could hear the faint clop of the departing carriage. The world, she thought, had closed its circle at last, not perfectly, perhaps, but with the grace of things that end as they must. She turned back into the warmth of her cottage, lit her lamp, and began to knit once more. The needles clicked, softly, steady, and sure. Outside, the snow thickened, covering every path and garden and unmarked grave alike, until Street Mary Mead lay still again, peaceful, if not entirely innocent. Winter deepened over Street Mary Mead, in the quiet way. English winters always did, without drama, without warning, just a steady surrender of color and warmth. A week had passed since Emile Moreau's visit, and already the village had folded the matter of Mrs. Penfold into its gentle routine of tea, gossip, and Sunday sermons. The gloves, the death, the secrets they had all become something spoken of only when the air was particularly still and the clock ticked too loudly between sentences. Yet, for Miss Marple, closure never meant forgetting. One afternoon, she walked to the churchyard with a small posy of winter jasmine in her hand. The ground was crisp with frost, the grass silvered and soft underfoot. She laid the flowers on Mrs. Penfold's grave, brushing a light dusting of snow from the carved letters, to sleep in peace, though life was troubled. That was what the stone said, though Miss Marple wondered if peace ever truly belonged to the dead, or only to those who survived them. She stood for a while, her thoughts drifting not to the sorrow of the case but to its peculiar symmetry. Arthur Penfold had sought redemption through secrecy, believing silence could repair what confession could not. His wife had mistaken that silence for deceit, and died trying to preserve the illusion of honor. The Reverend had chosen mercy over truth, thinking compassion would cleanse guilt, only to find it deepened his own. And Emile Moreau, the ghost who had returned, had lived too long in regret to know which of them had sinned most. Miss Marple sighed softly, as though answering an unspoken question. People do the wrong things for the right reasons, she murmured, and the right things far too late. The sound of footsteps broke her reverie. Inspector Slack approached, hat in hand, his expression lighter than she had seen it in weeks. "Afternoon, Miss Marple," he said. "I thought I might find you here. I've just had word from Paris again. Seems Moreau's gone back and closed his affairs for good. Sold his property, settled a few old accounts, left a note with the authorities, saying Street, Mary Mead had given him back his soul." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Then that's one less lost spirit wandering about, Inspector. How very satisfactory." He chuckled. "You might say that, though between you and me, I still can't quite make sense of why Penfold kept that letter hidden in the gloves. Seems an odd place, even for a secret." "Not odd at all," she said gently. "It was an act of irony, I think. Gloves conceal the hand, do they not? He hid his guilt where it could be touched but never seen. Perhaps he even meant his wife to find it eventually." Slack shook his head with a low whistle. "You always find poetry in the darkest corners, Miss Marple. I'll never understand how you do it." "Oh, it isn't poetry, Inspector," she said with a small smile. "It's simply that human beings are far more consistent than they appear. They sin, conceal, and confess in patterns as predictable as seasons. All one needs is patience to watch them unfold." He laughed, though, softly, as though in the presence of something sacred. "Well, the file's closed now, officially at least. I suppose you'll be turning your attention back to your roses." "I expect so," she said, glancing toward the frost-blurred hedgerow. "There's comfort in things that grow again, don't you think?" When he'd gone, she lingered a while longer in the quiet graveyard. The air was cold, but not unkind. The snow had begun again, drifting lightly across the graves, softening even the harsh edges of stone. She watched it fall, thinking how even death had its way of tidying things, of covering the rough patches that truth and sorrow left behind. By the time she returned to her cottage, dusk had gathered over the village. The windows glowed warmly as lamps were lit one by one. From somewhere down the lane came the faint laughter of children and the smell of coal fires catching in chimneys. Miss Marple paused at her gate, taking in the sight as one might admire a painting familiar, gentle, unchanging. Inside, she brewed a fresh pot of tea and set her knitting on the table beside her. The gloves, still folded neatly between the pages of her almanac, remained where she had left them. She did not open the drawer. Some things, she felt, were best left resting where they lay. Instead, she took up her needles, the rhythmic click of them filling the small room with a sound as steady as a heartbeat. The fire flickered, shadows danced along the walls, and beyond the window the village settled into evening. There would be other mysteries, other sorrows, other small deceptions dressed as decency. But for now, Street Mary Mead was quiet, and Miss Marple, in her own modest way, had restored balance to its fragile little world. She sipped her tea, smiled faintly to herself, and let the rhythm of her knitting carry her toward peace. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft as forgiveness, covering every secret the village had ever tried to hide. The end.